So as Richard said, Bob Forrest, I'm a family doctor here in Modesto. I have been for, 25 years. It's crazy. I am not a master catechist, moral theologian, or bioethicist. I'm a family doctor. I did in 1998, in the mid-90s, Father Pruitt got me interested in John Paul II's Gospel of Life. I read that. It really made a lot of sense to me. In 1998, I went to the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Boston for their first physician seminar. And I really didn't know what the heck I was doing there because all these other people were hospital chaplains and professors and things like that. But anyway, it turned out pretty nice because the information that I got there helped prepare me for future things that I did. And so I've maintained, that's pretty reasonable. You're just not going to be able to pick up these numbers down here. But that's pretty reasonable. So anyway, I took a special interest in bioethics, and I've always found it very interesting. The information I'm going to give you is relatively more practical than rather than the pretty heavy conceptual stuff. So anyway, let's get started because it's a lot of information. Now, I want to particularly thank Richard for giving me the slot in the afternoon, late in the afternoon, after lunch, to talk about death. Thank you, Richard. That was really good. That was really good. I pleaded to talk about the onset of life, the beginning of life. It's very clear. It's very simple. Egg, sperm, new human being. Don't mess with it. It's easy. It's easy. Death is a little fuzzier. Death is kind of a process that we go through. It doesn't happen all at one instant. And there are a lot of different things, but there are advantages to talk about death. But as you guys can talk about in vitro sterilization, post-abortion syndrome, or things like that, and those aren't things that you're necessarily got a handle on. It's not something you're going to experience. Let me tell you, you're all going to experience death. It's going to be great. We're all going to go through it. So, Nico, can I have the next slide, please? So, here is... Richard said good. Okay, so analyze issues. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just go over kind of the definition of death. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is ordinary care and what is extraordinary care. I'm going to talk about some good things that go on at the end of life, and I'm going to talk about some bad things that are going on at the end of life. Next one, please. So first to the theology. This is about as deep as we're going to get into theology. Is death, this is really catechism, death is the end of earthly life. It's where our bodies turn back to dust, and we return to the earth, and our spirits return to God, who gave us that life. Next slide. So, in the definition of death, you can see that death is kind of a process that we go through. It doesn't always follow in these steps, but usually something like this, where we lose consciousness, we lose all brain activity. The consciousness is kind of the higher consciousness from the cortex, the top of the brain, the big part of the brain. And then we lose all brain activity in the brain stem. That causes us to stop breathing. Our heart stops beating. And then our body starts cooling off. And then after about 3 to 4 hours, rigor mortis sets in. And so in the olden days, these used to be very important science because you know all these stories of the guy who was shocked or the guy who got the bee sting or the guy who's laying there in the casket and he wakes up. It was important to have a good diagnosis. Okay? So anyway, this, excuse me, I've got to use these glasses. This is a process that we all go through. And so I always like to return to the ancients a little bit. Could I have the next slide, please? I like to go back to the moral theologian and scientist Billy Crystal. This is from the movie The Princess Bride, which is a great movie if you haven't seen it before. And Andre the Giant here, this lovely fencer with 6 fingers, he's the guy who's going after it. Anyway, this guy appears to have died, and they bring him to Billy Crystal. And Billy Crystal is Max, the miracle worker, and he has some really sage advice. They bring him and they say, can you bring him back to life? And Billy Crystal says, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. mostly dead is slightly alive. Well, Billy's got a pretty good point there, and it's something to think about. Okay, go ahead with the next slide. So what happens is, we go through this process, and there's some point in here where we become legally dead. We cross a path of no return. We are cooling, we're dying, we're turning into dust. And it's certainly before rigor mortis, but it's not with loss of consciousness. Okay? So this is a little bit tricky. This is all the fuzzy stuff that I want to thank Richard for. This stuff is a little bit tricky. Okay, so go ahead with my next slide. So artificial respiration, you can't see it very well. He's got his bellows here, and he's putting some air into Wesley and resuscitating him. But artificial ventilation created quite a stir, because what happens in the late 40s and 50s, we began to be able to see these bodies who we put on a machine to breathe for them, but they would not respond in any way. Stop the machine, the breathing stops, the heartbeat stops. Always before in history that meant death. So are those people dead or are they alive? Okay, you can please go to the next slide. Around this, someplace in here between the cessation of respiration and the cessation of heartbeat, in some individuals, they pass through a period that we call brain death. And you can talk about whole brain death, mid-brain death, all sorts of things. Sometimes people lump persistent vegetative state. Hey, maybe they're there. But the point is that with the onset of ventilation and respiration, we had to figure out what we're going to do with these folks. And so it became important to try and define brain death. And brain death is death. Brain death is death. If we use the criteria, largely it's based on what was developed in 1969. There was a Blue Ribbon Committee. They're called the Harvard criteria. And they were criteria for neurologic death. And there's a whole set of things that you have to do in withdrawing the ventilator and making sure the patient won't have spontaneous respiration, if they give no neurological activity, things like this. It is a relatively clinical, meaning you don't have to do a bunch of fancy tests to do it. A good, competent doctor can do it at a bedside with a ventilated patient, and they know some lab tests and things like that. But we can make a determination there, carefully applied. These are legitimate criteria. Okay? Carefully applied. These are legitimate criteria. So if ever you're in a situation where you're worried about this, it's not a bad thing, like your loved one is on the ventilator and they say, well, your loved one's brain dead and you got to do this. It's not a terrible thing to say, may I have a second opinion, please, from another neurologist or neurosurgeon, or just a good, competent doctor should be able to do this for you. But I can tell you that at that point, when it's rigidly applied, there is no return. Okay? You're in that cascade. You're in death. Okay? You're in that. You're in death, and there's no going backwards here. Okay. Next slide, please. The Catechism actually addresses in 2296 that organ donation after death is a noble and meritorious act and should be encouraged. Right? So there are very definitely legitimate times to do organ donation. Obviously, with the non-paired organs, with the heart, you have to have somebody who's dead. It's not like one kidney you can give. So the important thing about this is that we realize that this is meritorious and the church supports it so long as all the criteria are fulfilled. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. We've got a lot of things to talk about. Ordinary versus extraordinary care. All right. This is talking about medical treatments. Okay? This is talking about ordinary medical treatments and extraordinary medical treatments. May I have the next slide, please? Basic care is something different. Basic care is not a medical treatment. Basic care is what people get as a result of their human dignity. Okay? They get warm. They are to care for someone like that. We keep them warm. We keep them clean. We give them food. We give them water. Okay? All right. On to the next slide. So if you want to look at ordinary versus extraordinary, what you're talking about in ordinary is something that's low risk versus high risk, simple versus complex, a relatively routine treatment rather than an experimental or unusual treatment, a good chance of benefit or a very small chance of benefit, inexpensive, expensive. I mean, these are not absolutes, but you get the idea. And you also get the idea that sometimes, for some people, in some situations, care would be ordinary. But in other situations, same treatment, different person, different situation might be extraordinary. Okay, next slide, please. So let me just give you this one example of the breast mass, okay? For whatever reason, a mammogram is taken or a CT scan is taken, and on it, we notice a breast mass. Okay? The breast mass is 1 centimeter, it's spiculated, it's highly suspicious for breast cancer. Okay? There is a time when you do that CT scan on a woman who has dementia and is in a nursing home and is 88 years old and is not on estrogen therapy and does not have any pain or problem related to her breast, that you say, forget it, doesn't matter, that's not the big problem right now, okay? She does not have to go through a mastectomy or a big lumpectomy and all sorts of testing and things like that, okay? That would be extraordinary in her situation. For most of the time when we find a breast mass, that would be ordinary care to have a lumpectomy. And if a 40-year-old mother of two said, oh my goodness, I have breast cancer, it's all over, I quit, I'm not going to do anything, I don't want any treatment, she would be denying herself ordinary care. Okay? And that's not good either. Okay? She's not thinking about her family. So that's just one example. Another example, like liver transplant, a patient who has a long history of like infectious disease, like hepatitis C, or somebody with out of control alcoholic liver disease, you could see that would be extraordinary care. The patient may desire it very, very much, but that is way extraordinary care and not a prudent use of the resources of the society. And you can choose not to have treatments done because it's burdensome to you. It creates an excess financial burden to your family. It creates an excess pain burden to your family. There's not the expected outcome as a result. You don't have to choose absolutely everything. Okay? It has to be weighed in every single situation. What would be ordinary? What would be extraordinary? Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so the Catechism again says that discontinuing medical procedures, burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, can be legitimate. It's the refusal of overzealous treatment. Okay? And the desire there is not to cause death, but you just are accepting that your ability to impede death no longer exists. Okay, next slide, please. All right, let's talk about a few bad things, because I want to do this quick enough so that we can have just a couple of questions at the end. Okay, bad things that are going on in the society right now today. One is the withdrawal of basic care from people. Two, I'm going to talk about physician-assisted suicide, which is going on in this country. And three, I'm going to talk about euthanasia, mainly looking at the Dutch experience. We don't have to wonder about physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia in Western countries because we already have the data. It's been going on for years. Okay, so we can look at real data, real numbers. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So I think the most illustrative case of withdrawal of basic care is the Terri Schiavo case from about 2005. This was a very, very difficult case. Terri suffered an injury, was admitted to hospital. She received negligent care while there in the hospital. She sustained further injury. She became she wasn't really persistent vegetative state, but she had no good higher functioning. She could not clearly communicate with people. There were some people who felt they could communicate with her, but not consistently. It wasn't a consistent thing. And she could not feed herself. She could not provide for any of her hygiene or things like that. Nevertheless, she lived. And she would respond to her environment in some ways, sometimes, some days. Now, what happened is her husband sued the hospital, won a large settlement. He then is kind of moving on, He's got another lady in his life, and Terri's been in this state for a number of years, and he petitions to have her feeding tube removed. Well, the problem is she's not dying from anything. She may not be highly functioning. She may not be what we would qualify as conscious, but she's alive. And so what happens is the husband wanted to discontinue, but the parents said, no, we want to continue that feeding. Eventually, the husband prevailed. The tube was removed, and 13 days later, with no food and no water, Terri Schiavo died. Okay, next slide, please. So the Schiavo case has a couple of interesting things about it. And then let's just start right here. Terri was receiving artificial hydration and nutrition. It's not that the food or water that she was getting was artificial. It's the way it was delivered was artificial. It came through a tube. Okay? So, is artificial hydration and nutrition a medical treatment, or is it basic care, like just food that we take by mouth or water that we drink of our own volition? Warmth and hygiene. And I hate to tell you, I'm going to tell you that you have to think like, don't start making big, don't start painting with broad brushstrokes here. Because think of Mother Teresa caring for the poor in Calcutta. They did what they could do with the spoon. Okay? And that was the extent of care. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying that that's the best we can do in this country, but what I'm saying is, it depends on the situation. If the person's body can assimilate the food properly, then continuing hydration and nutrition is a good thing to do. Okay? Doesn't matter whether they're Einstein or not. But on the other hand, if you're pouring water into someone with congestive heart failure, cirrhosis of the liver, or ascites, they're full of fluid and things like that in the last days of their life, that's not necessarily good medicine either. Okay? You're giving them things that they cannot properly assimilate and use. You actually make their condition worse. You give them intravenous fluid because you think you can't starve them to death. But on the other hand, we're chasing with Lasix trying to get that out, and so there are times when you have to make judgments about artificial hydration and nutrition. But in general, I would tell you that we should have a bias for bios. We should have a bias for life, and if you're uncertain, you continue. Okay? The other thing that's interesting about the Schiavo case is, do the wishes of a spouse always trump the wishes of the rest of the parents and children? Terri and her husband were estranged. It's a really fishy story. It's very, very troubling. And so then that's the bias for bios. We have a bias in the favor of life. So the Schiavo case is very interesting, very illustrative, and very sad to my mind. I think that we owe people everyone basic care. And I think that we have to have a bias for giving people artificial hydration and nutrition when their bodies can properly assimilate. Okay? All right. Next slide. Catholic teaching. There are lots of guideposts here to go back and reflect on. And I'll tell you, I subscribe to the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, and the theologians and philosophers just are battling this one out about when is too much and when is not enough. And there are also esoteric cases. We'll forget it for now. Next slide, please. So, physician-assisted suicide. This is another big one that's going to get bigger. Okay, next slide. So, the history of this is a clinic in Switzerland that's been doing this since 1941. The Netherlands legalized physician-assisted, which means the doctor writes you a prescription, we give you the medicine, and say, when you're ready, you take that hemlock. Okay? The physician doesn't actively do something there. So, legalized in Oregon in 1994. The contagion spread from Holland to the Netherlands, Luxembourg. It looks like it's going across the coast. Watch out, don't lose Idaho. You're going from Oregon, Washington, Montana. So anyway, those are the 3 states where physician-assisted suicide is legal. Okay, next slide, Nico. Here's the result of the Oregon experience. The data is a few years old. But basically, 1 out of every 300 deaths in Oregon is by people committing suicide with the assistance of their doctor. The numbers are not huge. Oregon is not a huge state. There are 59 of them in 2004. The numbers trended gradually up. It's in the high 70s now. 0 out of the 79, 0 or 1 out of the 79 in 2011, the latest report, were referred for mental health care. 0. Virtually all of them are white, college or more education, and 3/4 of them are single. These are their diagnoses. usually cancer, about 80% cancer. Interesting thing, they say, why are you choosing this? What would you think is the big reason why they're choosing this? Would you think it's pain? It's pain. Less than 30%. Or around 30%. Fear of being a burden on your family. I wonder if they'd ask the family that, what the family would say. And then loss of autonomy. That is huge, loss of autonomy. People like to be their boss. Remember that as we get older, we get sick, you've got to try and let go of autonomy and let those people care for you, but it's really, really hard. Okay, so physician-assisted suicide increasing in Oregon, now in Washington and Montana. There are items on the ballot or in the state houses in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, a couple others. Georgia and one of the other southern states have a no physician suicide thing coming up, like the one that we've dealt with before in California. Okay, next slide. Euthanasia. Oh, I wish my Dutch wife was here. Go to the next slide. No, Annie actually her family. I firmly believe that they've personally touched by this. So the Dutch legalized euthanasia in physician-assisted suicide in 1981, and they decided it was okay for doctors to do inpatients, to euthanize patients. The doctor actively to do it, not just give them a prescription, but to come in and give them something. In 2000, it had been tolerated for a long time. It goes on in Switzerland as well. So this column of numbers adds up to 100%. This is from 2010. It's from the medical journal, The Lancet, the British Medical Journal. And what they did is they looked at 5% of the deaths in the Netherlands. They have 130,000 deaths in the Netherlands. They looked at 6,000 of them. And they analyzed what led up to the death. Was there an end-of-life decision? Okay? And they asked this, data basically came from the doctors, asking the doctor what led up to the death. Was there an end-of-life decision? Okay? So some people drop dead on the street. Okay, there's no time for an end-of-life decision. Some people get killed in accidents. That's just over. So that's what this other deaths is, about 30% of deaths. Some said, enough. And the doctors picked one, put them in a category. They said, enough. I've got metastatic cancer. I'm 90 years old. I've lived a good life. I don't want to put a bunch of surgery and chemotherapy that isn't going to help me. Let me go. It's okay. 18%. People who said, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to stop eating and drinking. 0.4%. Look at how wonderful. Euthanasia is only 2.8%. Isn't that great? Because in the 80s and 90s, it was about 4% in the Netherlands. And now, look, it's what a humane society. Now the euthanasia rate's dropping. No explicit request. This is somebody who went into the hospital and somebody decided, you've seen the end of the road. Assisted suicide plummeted. Look how humane physician-assisted suicide is. Now that we have euthanasia, we don't even need to do this because people would rather have somebody else give them a shot than drink the stuff. Intensified alleviation. That's kind of interesting. 36% of the deaths in the Netherlands are judged by the doctor to be intensified alleviation. Now, some of that may be legitimate and meritorious. Hospice-type care. Yeah, they don't want to define it. They don't want to define it. I've looked and looked and looked, and nobody wants to define it. But a lot of it, great question, Rose. A lot of it is just stoning people out of their mind with narcotic medication. And it's not that narcotics are bad in dying people. I'm not saying that at all. Narcotics are good. They're very comforting. Usually people breathe better, relax better, feel better, they can be awake. I'm not telling you to take away grandma's morphine, okay? But there's a difference between adequate pain control and bombing somebody out of their gourd with narcotics. So this number has expanded from 18% 5 years ago to 36% this year. Continuous sedation. This means the doctor makes a decision. Oh, you're dying. I'm going to put you to sleep. You're going to stay asleep until you die. 12.3%. Okay? Look, I'm not saying that all of this is bad, but you're looking at this, add up these people. You're looking at 50% of the people in Holland are dying with a doctor's help. That's scary. Okay, next slide, please. The church is very clear on this. Intentional euthanasia, whatever its form promoted, is gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person. Okay? Next slide. Good things are happening at the end of life, too. It's not all bad. There are good things that happen. Okay. I'm going to go to the second one first. Finishing your business. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the lady who wrote the Big Death and Dying thing, she talks about people finishing their business. I have seen remarkable, transformative healing between you were listening to Rachel's Vineyard. Sometimes families come together. Sometimes dads and sons say, I'm sorry, Dad. It's okay, son. It's not important in the big thing. Just be patient with your kids. These things happen. I see them. I see them. Planning with your spouse. Talking with your spouse. Saying the uncomfortable things. It happens. Not all the time. Lots of times. Reliance on the sacraments. This is a very good thing that can happen at the end of life. Reconciling with God. Preparing to meet your Maker. Receiving viaticum, receiving communion more frequently. Anointing. These are all good things that happen. An advance directive. Having an advance directive that clearly expresses your bias for what kind of care you would like to receive. These are not legally mandatory documents that the doctor is going to be handicapped, but it's going to help encourage a doctor who is resistant to back off on over-aggressive care. And it can also say, you can say there's a Catholic version through the Archdiocese of Los Angeles that says, my church teaching is that I prefer to receive nutrition and hydration until my natural death if my body's able to assimilate it. Not a bad thing to have. Okay? Talk with your doctor if you have problems or concerns. I'll tell you, most people, and it's good to do, most people have an advance directive that says, I don't want to have artificial prolongation of my life, and I don't want a bunch of tubes and things if it's not going to help me. And pretty much that's commonly understood, and no one ever argues about that anymore. So in some withdrawal care cases, it's really not that helpful. But listen, just having a discussion. More important than the doctor, more important than the document, talk to someone who you know and trust. It's usually best one of your family members or close friends, so that they can be an advocate for you if you are no longer able to make those decisions. Declining excessive or burdensome care. There is a feeling in some of us that as you're faced with your own mortality, that you want to get everything done, and that you want every hope for a cure. And that's good. That's the way you're programmed. You're supposed to have a bias for life. Okay? But sometimes you've probably seen people who get a little irrational. And they think that everything has to be done, and they're upset that everything's done, and they get conspiratorial, and everybody's trying to kill me, and all this kind of stuff. And so, making a personal decision about how much care is appropriate care. Sometimes people feel like, I have to do this for my family. And that's the family member that you want to talk to. And say, you know what? I've lived a good life. I have good things. I've got a serious illness. I'm going to die from it. I'd rather die from it in X number of months without having to go through all these interventions and things at home, rather than get a bunch of interventions and stuff and die a week, a month, 2 months later, earlier, things like that. That's okay. utilizing hospice care. Now, I'm not telling you that everyone who goes into hospice care in Oregon gets great care. But I think that most, all of the time, folks who work for hospice are very accustomed to working with people who have a strong pro-life bias, as well as a strong autonomy, I'm going to kill myself bias. So I think they're getting better and better at negotiating that. And I think that the vast majority of cases, hospice will try and work with you and to try and do what you want. I don't run into people at hospice who say, this guy's, he's headed for the boneyard, let's get this over with. I've just never seen it. I've never seen it. Organ donation is another good thing. This usually comes in the event of a traumatic death, sudden, unexpected traumatic death from an aneurysm, from an accident, something like that. This is another thing that you can think about and talk about. If you have a good advocate, if you have a friend or a family member who's going to be a good advocate for you, you go to the catechism, says it's a meritorious thing. Okay? Done properly. Okay, next slide. Advanced directives, okay, go on to the next. And if not, by somebody legally entitled, and I suggest you pick one of your good, strong Catholic friends if you don't have someone who is in your family in that position. Okay? It's not always best just to pick your spouse. I mean, usually that's the situation, but it just depends on your personal situation. Okay, next slide. Summary. Next slide. I'm going to replace everything you guys heard today. Okay? Here's the important stuff. Remember this? You're golden. Okay? Catholic bioethics, wrapped up. 3 points. Innocent human life is sacred from conception to natural death. Period. Sexuality is ordered in conjugal love of the husband and wife. Period. Conjugal love, always unitive and open procreation there. Catholic bioethics. Right there. That's it. That's all fine, Mark. You don't have to remember anything else. Just those 3. Okay, next slide. I just couldn't resist putting that one in there. Okay, it's election year, guys. Look at the platforms. Look at what the people you're voting for support. Okay? There's a very clear choice in a lot of these issues. So, next slide, I think, is just references. Go ahead. This is the USCCB pro-life activities. I mean, you guys know that. You can go to usccb.org and you can find all sorts of stuff. Okay, so they have just their general pro-life section, and they've got this one about human life and dignity, which is relatively new. And I always like to plug EWTN Newslink. If you use your computer and you just go to this EWTN Newslink, you can sign up and you can get that update. So you just click on it as your favorites and you can get a little other news in your day. Okay, next slide. This is where you get it's larchdiocese.org. They have a Catholic healthcare directive. The National Catholic Bioethics Center also has one. The California Medical Association has one. I think that's the end of it. Why don't you leave that up just in case people want to look at that. And then maybe you go after like 2 minutes, we can put it to the one behind it in case anybody wants to write it down. Okay, do you guys have any questions for me?